In the heart of the Pacific Northwest, nestled among dense forests and serene landscapes, a sleeping giant once stood undisturbed. A mountain known for its beauty, its power hidden deep within. But on the morning of May 18th, 1980, Mount St. Helens roared to life in a catastrophic eruption. What began as a series of subtle warnings culminated in one of the most violent volcanic events in recorded history. A massive landslide, an earth-shattering explosion, and eruptions spanning over the following 6 years. Entire forests were decimated, rivers transformed, and lives lost in moments of unimaginable destruction. Mount St. Helens, the deadliest volcanic eruption in the history of the United States.
I figured that I was going to live my life and go through my career in the U.S. as a volcanologist without ever seeing an eruption within our borders.
Nestled in the rugged beauty of the Pacific Northwest, Mount St. Helens has long been a symbol of both tranquility and hidden power, rising majestically above the forests and rivers of southwestern Washington. Mount St. Helens belongs to the Cascade Range, a chain of volcanic peaks stretching from California to British Columbia. This fiery lineage is the product of an ongoing geological battle deep beneath the surface, where the Juan de Fuca plate dives beneath the North American plate in a process known as subduction. For centuries, Native American tribes living in the region revered the mountain. They called it Luala Kluv, meaning smoking mountain, and spoke of its fiery temper in stories passed down through generations. To them, it was both a sacred place and a harbinger of danger. European settlers, however, were captivated by its beauty and fertile surroundings. By the early 20th century, Mount St. Helens was affectionately known as the Mount Fuji of America. Its snow-capped peak drawing adventurers and nature lovers from far and wide. The mountain had erupted repeatedly over the last 40,000 years, with its most recent major eruption occurring in the mid-1800s. Still, by the 20th century, its activity had lulled, and its slopes became a haven for hikers, loggers, and campers. However, Mount St. Helens was quietly stirring.
One of the things that we'd kicked around is incessantly from probably 1960 to 1975 is, when will one of these erupt? which one will erupt first? What's the chances of it erupting?
My first impression, in other words, was one of not quite chaos, but certainly an unmanaged situation where we were just reacting to what the volcano was doing rather than knowing exactly what was going on.
One of the best comments was by a state forestry man who stood up and said in this room, he said, "Do you mean to tell me that we can put a man on the moon and you can't even tell us whether the volcano will erupt or not?" And I said, "That's correct, we cannot tell."
And there was this big press conference with several TV cameras, the national media were there, and the Forest Service and the USGS people were talking, and I had to give a spiel about what I'd seen, which was essentially nothing.
In March 1980, a series of small earthquakes signaled magma movement down under the surface.
We received a notification very early on, right after March 20th, when the first earthquake began. And that was the beginning of the most hectic, I don't know, 10, 12 months of my life, I guess. We watched very closely as the earthquake swarm escalated in March. And on the 24th of March, I think it was, Don Molyneux came out here to Vancouver.
And then that was the 26th, the 27th at noon was the first, or about noon was the first pop. And then things spun wildly out of control as far as my part of it went, because it was just 20 hours a day of questions. Try to explain things to people. Reporters came in swarms.
And then at noon on the 27th, there was the first explosion. And that got me going, and so I got in an airplane and showed up at Portland Airport at 2 in the morning on the 28th of March. I immediately rented a car and raced over to Vancouver to the Forest Service office and ran down into the basement and looked at the seismic drums to see what was happening. And that was the beginning of a, 18-hour a day, 7-day a week, 7-month investment of my time and energy trying to figure out what was about to happen.
We were sitting in this Jeep that I had by one of these cans that Andre and I had set out to collect ash. I wanted to just see what it was like, and was sitting in the car after that taking notes. And Barry, I was in the driver's seat. Barry's on the other side. And this earthquake occurred. Wong, wong, wong. When you're in a vehicle, sitting still with the engine not running, it's really, and the vehicle itself, with a higher center, really accentuated. We just swayed back and forth, and it lasted. It just seemed like it lasted half a minute, but it wasn't that long. It was quite impressive. That was certainly the one I felt the most of that period.
So it was a highly charged atmosphere. It was very exciting. It was pretty, I guess it was frightening to be on a volcano. We were having earthquakes of quite regularly magnitude 3, sometimes over 4. We had some pretty strong discussions about whether or not we should be in the volcano, around the volcano, etc., for personal safety reasons. And the other side taking, well, we got to get the sign spots available.
By late March, the mountain began to bulge on its north side, indicating an accumulation of pressure.
We couldn't believe the results, because the results showed absolutely no change between 1972 and 1980. Even though visually we could see the north side of the mountain changing, that meant that the east side was not changing at all. And so this coupled with the fact that the Spirit Lake tilting didn't show anything, told us that all the deformation on the mountain was local to the mountain, and even more local than that was on the north side of the mountain only. So we were really able then to focus in on that part of the volcano rather than frittering away our resources by looking at the entire edifice.
The growing bulge on the north flank expanded at a rate of up to 6 feet per day.
By the time I got here, the bulge was obvious, and we were measuring the rate of northward movement of the bulge at about 6 feet a day, and we knew that wasn't so good.
A series of smaller eruptions and steam blasts occurred in April and May, raising concerns about a larger eruption.
In the nearly 2-month period before May 18, what was essentially happening at Mount St. Helens was that magma or molten material was moving up from some deep reservoir beneath the mountain up into the volcano itself. And what basically happened is that this viscous magma moved up into the volcano, and it began to grow or form what we call a dome or a cryptodome inside the volcano. And that inflating body of magma or molten material actually broke the north side of the volcano and began to cause the north side of the volcano to expand out toward the north.
Despite the USGS scientists monitoring the volcano's activity, they were unaware of quite how catastrophic the consequences of the looming eruption would be, albeit breathtaking. Mount St. Helens' slumber was about to come to an end.
It was a beautiful blue sky day, and the mountain was sitting out there, and suddenly I saw this mushroom cloud go up above the volcano and climb rapidly up into the stratosphere.
You had to see it to believe it, to get that total impression.
I had seen a number of the small steam explosions that had been occurring for the 2 months prior to May 18, but I had never seen anything on this magnitude, and I knew that it was a huge eruption compared to what we'd seen so far.
On the morning of May 18, 1980, a magnitude 5.1 earthquake triggered a massive landslide on the northern side of the mountain, the largest in recorded history. Volcanologist David Johnston, a principal scientist on the USGS monitoring team, was manning an observation post 6 miles north of Mount St. Helens on the morning of the eruption.
Well, on the morning of May 18th, we had our normal meeting at 7 o'clock or thereabouts. Earlier that morning, Dave Johnston had been able to make a measurement with using the range master that he had, Coldwater 2. He measured from there over to Goat Rocks on the volcano and found that there had been no change in rate of movement, actually a slight decrease in rate of movement since the last time the measurement had been made some time before. So that was reported at the meeting. And then I was preparing to go up and replace Dave that morning, but I didn't go right away, but waited around at the Forest Service building. I was down in the room where the seismographs were at 8:32 in the morning, and I heard a sound, and I just looked over my shoulder, probably just a split second after the earthquake, the big earthquake had started, and saw that this was something very large, larger than we'd seen before. Watched it for a few seconds just to confirm that.
There was a growing wave as this thing went, and I'd been through several that size before, so I knew what was coming, so I had to take down both instruments, lay them on the ground because they would have been knocked over. And then I sat there and tried to ride it for a while, and it just threw me on the ground. It was that much of a rolling earthquake, and it seemed to go on forever.
And then I ran upstairs to the next floor, up to the radio desk of the Forest Service, and called Dave. And what I wanted to do was to ask him if anything was happening at the mountain. And we couldn't get through. There was no answer.
And ran over to the radio and tried to raise Dave Johnston, and gave him a call. And when I didn't hear from him, and I didn't hear the repeater answer me back. And our repeater was located up on Coldwater Peak, which was quite a ways north of Johnston Ridge and way up high. And so I suddenly realized, well, something really serious has happened. If Coldwater Peak has been blown away and the repeater is destroyed, then I figured that something awful had happened at Coldwater too as well. So I guess I had the realization right away that this was some kind of a tragedy. And on the one hand, it was this huge, exciting, and interesting magmatic eruption, and on the other hand, I was pretty certain that something terrible had happened to Dave. So it was a strange day for me.
David Johnston was one of 57 people that tragically lost their lives that day. The landslide caused the north flank to collapse, instantly depressurizing the magma chamber beneath. A lateral explosion shot a pyroclastic flow of hot gas, ash, and rock outward at over 300 miles per hour, devastating everything within a 230 square mile area.
On the morning of May 18, what actually happened was that a magnitude 5.1 earthquake caused this weakened north flank of the volcano to break loose and to slide under the influence of gravity down into the North Fork of the Toutle River. This was a gigantic landslide. It was the first event in the series of events that occurred on May 18. The landslide basically uncorked this pressurized body of magma and allowed it to explode or expand out towards the north very rapidly. This is what we call the lateral blast. It was a horizontally directed explosion of incredible magnitude. It caused this expanding cloud of ash, rocks, and gases to move out across the countryside to the north at speeds of several hundred miles an hour.
Following the lateral blast, a vertical column of ash and pumice rose about 15 miles into the stratosphere, ejecting over a cubic mile of material. Ashfall affected several states, reaching as far as the eastern U.S. within days.
The Forest Service got phone calls saying that some people were seeing an eruption column starting from the volcano. And I drove to Pearson Air Park immediately. The Forest Service had a spotter plane ready to go. Dave Gibney, their normal pilot, was there. Remember, this was early on a Sunday morning. It was amazing. And we were off the ground probably at 9:05 or something like that. I mean, it was really, really rapid. And got up to the point where we could really see the mountain well, I suppose between 9:20 and 9:25, something like that. By that time, the blast had been completed. Of course, we could never get around to the north side of the mountain, so I couldn't see what had happened there, but we were able to see the south side very well. The flank was scored by mud flows that had come down it. There was this terrific, very vigorous vertical eruption column that was the stem of the mushroom or the toadstool that then blossomed out at greater height. And we could see during the course of the morning small pyroclastic flows starting down in various places down the south flank, never getting very far. But for most of the morning, we saw this tremendous, whenever we could get around toward the west side of the mountain, saw this tremendous ash cloud roiling out toward the northwest. And I can only assume that was coming off of the big pyroclastic flows that were going off in that direction that later built the pumice plain.
The directed blast was really the most destructive event that occurred on the morning of May 18. It completely destroyed an area of 230 square miles in the matter of somewhere between 5 and 9 minutes. It essentially killed every living thing within an area of 230 square miles, and it destroyed hundreds of acres of virgin forest, and it was an incredibly spectacular event.
was a very eventful morning, but it was sobering because I remember thinking up in the airplane that Dave just couldn't have survived this, especially when we got around to the west side and saw all this ash headed in his direction. It was totally quiet to us in the airplane because of the drone of the airplane engine, I guess. All we could hear was that and the conversation in the cockpit and radio. People were radioing in, telling us that there were mud flows in various river drainages. We could see those in all the drainages except for the main fork of the Toutle. But it was almost a surreal experience because it was so quiet. We could see so much happening, and we were in this kind of cocoon in the airplane that we couldn't escape from.
When people through the summer came, said they wanted to see what happened, I would suggest to all of them that they first go down to Pearson Field and buy a ride on the plane and go up and make a loop around the mountain, because I thought only then could you really understand how the part you could see from the ground fit in with the overall eruption. And it was stunning to see those small increments that you could see on the ground, and realizing that that is such a small part of the overall devastated area or the affected area.
Entire forests were flattened. Rivers were clogged with debris. And Spirit Lake was permanently altered.
There were places north of the volcano which was left pristine. There was old growth in there because it was a major playland for the Portland area. And just huge trees, and you could walk in there and not hear a sound because of the vegetation that. And it was just a gorgeous, wonderful wilderness there. And to know that in your mind, I actually haven't seen it 4 days beforehand, and come back and see it all gone, that was quite a shock. It took me about 2 weeks of flying across the boundary of the blast zone before I stopped having that physical, emotional hit.
This avalanche came down the North Fork Toutle and just pushed all the trees in the valley out of the valley down at the head of this avalanche. So at the front end of the avalanche was this big giant pile of trees and fence posts and bushes and shrubs that had been just scraped off the valley floor and were all down at the end of the avalanche.
'83-year-old Harry R. Truman had made his home near the mountain in 1929 and ran the Spirit Lake Lodge. When warnings of an impending eruption grew louder, Harry famously told reporters, "I'm not leaving. That mountain and I are a part of each other."
We drove down and we stopped in at Harry Truman, who had come out of his lodge, and he sort of waved us in. So we went in and had a Coke or something with him. He was drinking his typical Coke and whiskey, of course. And so we had quite a chat with Harry. Harry said, "That is the earthquake everybody's going to talk about. All the chandeliers swayed east-west here, not north-south as they had before."
To Harry, the mountain wasn't a threat. It was an old friend, one he had lived alongside for over half a century.
Later, I wondered if Harry Truman had maybe painted himself into a corner by being so firmly saying, "I'm never going to leave." So even if he had at some time become convinced that it was too dangerous, because it didn't take an eruption to wipe out Harry, just a landslide failure of that expanding bulge would have taken him out, I think.
Oh, I'm like that old captain. By God, I'm going down with the ship. I said, if the damn thing takes this mountain, I'm going along with it. I'd rather be dead than to live without it.
The Spirit Lake Lodge, along with Harry, was buried beneath a torrent of ash, rock, and mud. His body was never found.
The first 2 weeks after May 18th are kind of a blur to me because so much was happening so quickly. In general, though, I'll tell you that I, along with Jim Moore and Pete Lippman, spent a full day on May 19th flying around trying to figure out what had happened on May 18th. And we got the general picture in order then, although, of course, the very important details were done by others later on. But we wanted then to reestablish as much as we could of the older geodetic network that we'd been used prior to May 18th. And so over the next few days, as time permitted, we would revisit some of the old reflector stations, and they were all damaged beyond repair. But we tried to recover a couple of them and got approximate changes over the eruption. We put out new stations, and we quickly started to remonitor the volcano again because we had no idea what was going to happen down the road, and we thought it likely that there would be more eruptions during the summer, and indeed that took place.
Before the dust had literally settled in the summer of 1980, there were USGS scientists swarming all over the area out in the blast zone, studying the pyroclastic flows, studying the debris avalanche deposit, studying the directed blast deposit, and basically looking at all of the different facies of the May 18 event.
Jimmy Carter came on a certain time, and the day after that, people throwing helicopters at us. So from that point on, we had nobody had any trouble getting into the field who wanted to. I teamed up with Dan Zarishin. We had this beautiful A-Star, French A-Star, brand new helicopter that Cascades Helicopter got, and the president of the company was flying it, very proud of it. And that was when I started doing the in-close stratigraphy. And I already had a handle from outside, so I was bringing the same stuff in, systematically, and we flew in around, Spirit Lake and put in stops there. And, gradually I was getting into thicker stuff, and there were other things besides airfall deposit, stuff that fell out of the sky, to work on it, and it just was part of the same stratigraphy. So that's what led me eventually into other things.
The eruption provided unprecedented data on volcanic behavior, particularly lateral blasts and magma chamber dynamics.
So then we'd have a meeting with everyone who would either bring in their data and discuss it and what they thought about what the volcano was going to do. So there were some crews that were looking at what the volcano did during the eruption. So there were months spent investigating the May 18th deposits. And then there were people who were out measuring deformation and the real-time situation at the volcano, so to try to discern what the volcano was going to do next, trying to recognize patterns that the volcano was going to do. So these discussions would last an hour and a half of reporting what had happened that day.
It was just out of this world sort of experience. And every step you took was a place that nobody had ever actually had stepped before. It made an impression. Of course, most of the time we were working our tails off and we were all exhausted. We were working 20-hour days, 7 days a week. So there wasn't too much philosophical introspection at the time, although it would hit you once in a while.
Anyway, it was really clear that there was nothing left at Coldwater 2, and the car was gone, the trailer was gone, and there was no indication of anything there. But we landed just downblast from Coldwater 2 at the bottom of the South Coldwater drainage on these new hot deposits. And I tell you, it was like walking on the moon. I will never forget the feeling we had. We asked the pilot to keep the engine running. First of all, he had to touch down very gently and try to move it around and find some solid place, because the blast deposit was very soft and very irregular in places and quite inflated. And there was smoke coming out of there, steam coming out of the ground in hundreds of thousands of places out there. So it was like It was like walking on the moon. There was nothing living as far as you could see in any direction. There was no sound except the helicopter running. And no insects, no animals, nothing green, just gray.
The pyroclastic flow had floated on some sort of pneumatic cushion and had not even dropped things through a lot of that area because it was moving fairly fast onto that area. And then, so there's this great big pond, so you could actually walk on May 18th deposits right down to the pond. And so I was in Big 7 for measuring temperatures. Here was this huge pond that had actually been deposited less than 8 hours beforehand. So I went down and decided to walk out on it. And of course, the first step, my foot disappeared up over the boot top, and this fluff, it was just very highly inflated powder. And it was inflated with air, hot air. Basically, you had to incorporate it on the way down the mountain. But I wanted to get out on it, so I realized after a couple of attempts that if I did a tentative pat to see whether I was going to sink in, I sort of formed a snowshoe or an ash shoe. And the more I patted, the more fumaroles I would generate, and the bigger the area would get. So you could actually pat it enough so you could deflate enough of that deposit to make a sort of a shoe, and you could stand on it. And then you could do it in a second. So you'd walk out doing the patty, patty, pat, and patty, patty, pat. And so I got out quite far on this pyroclastic flow and was able to measure a temperature profile both vertically and laterally through the thing. But if you took one step without doing that, of course, you just disappear. And it was pretty hot, 650 degrees centigrade.
On July 22nd, Mount St. Helens erupted with a series of powerful explosions, breaking a month-long stretch of relative quiet. In the days leading up to this event, the mountain showed clear signs of unrest. The summit swelled noticeably. Earthquake activity intensified, and emissions of sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide surged.
And so we were out in the field on July 22nd in a helicopter, and we were down looking at some mud on the North Fork Toutle, and we were out of radio contact. And so when we got it back in the helicopter, took off, flew back to the volcano and came up from underneath the clouds, and here was this 20,000-foot ash column rising up, and the radio going, it's still at 30,000 feet and climbing. And where we were in the helicopter, we were so close, you couldn't see up to the top of the column of ash.
After about 2 hours of circling over this and not seeing anything, suddenly this immense black eruption cloud came pouring up out of the white layer, the cloud tops. And I couldn't believe my eyes. I mean, I thought, this is the most incredible thing I've ever seen in my life.
And so that whole next several hours, we were running out of film because we didn't have enough film. It was like a battle with not enough bullets, more ammo, and we had to count all our rolls of film, see how many we had so we could make sure everyone had a couple of rolls of film. We had landed on the ground, and one of the geologists was taking a temperature measurement of the ash flow, and he had his back turned to us. The people in Vancouver were telling us to get off the ground because they didn't know what the volcano was going to do. And we were right next to an ash flow, so another ash flow coming down would be right where we were. And we couldn't, nobody wanted to get out of the helicopter and go get the guy and pull him into the helicopter. And there's no siren or anything to tell him to come back. So it wasn't until he had finished and finally turned around that we were all, get back in the helicopter.
So Rick and I got out, and we ran around and wandered around in this hot stuff, trying to keep from sinking in and burning ourselves. And there were these weird little volcanoes that were produced where these fumaroles were coming out of the ground. The material had piled up to form these little miniature volcanoes. And the whole area had this incredibly strange organic stench to it because of all the cooking vegetation and the distillation of vegetation that was taking place under the surface. I remember Rick and I dug some holes, and there had been a light rain on the top of the blast deposit, and so the upper part was wet, but when you dug down more than a few centimeters or so, it was gray and white and hot, and it was just like hot ashes. And when you tried to dig a hole in it with your shovel, this stuff would just flow back and forth like hot fireplace ashes. And I realized that this was hot. It was a piece of the cryptodome, and it was so hot it dried out the ash and kept it dry, even though there had been some rain. And so I brought out a big plastic sample bag, and I picked up this rock and put it in quickly, and put it in the sample bag. And then when I turned around to look somewhere, it melted its way right through the bottom of the bag. Anyway, it was incredible. Hoblet and I were blown away by what we saw. We stayed there maybe half an hour or so while the helicopter was running, and we just couldn't get enough of it. I mean, we were taking pictures, running around digging holes. It was incredibly exciting and very interesting and all new and intriguing. Then we got in the helicopter and we flew around. It was still very dusty, and there were phreatic explosions, rootless phreatic explosions taking place above the North Fork of the Toutle River out in the pumice plain. And some of those were going to 18 or 20,000 feet. So it was a pretty hard place to get around in the helicopter because there were a lot of ashy places that we really couldn't visit safely without getting into the ash.
I guess what amazed me is some of the events. One of them that really amazed me is what happened at Spirit Lake. And we still haven't told that story. It's a sort of hidden story, but it's very clear. Maybe the third day of this helicopter excursion, we landed over Harmony Falls, and you could see the whole shores of the lake had been stripped of trees. The trees were down, and that they weren't really stripped by the blast, but they were all laid down. Then below a level, there was like a line below that, and every tree was gone from that. And the lake itself was full of logs. And so it seemed that there had been a big slosh of water around there, and it had rinsed off the lower slopes and had put the timber in the lake. That's why it was there. I mean, all the timber in the lake didn't make sense. There's no way for it to be thrown in. But you could see it was washed in. You started working on that a little bit, and you realized, geez, when you got up, there was hundreds of feet, I don't remember now, maybe 600 feet or so above the lake that this water had clearly washed to. Might have even pushed it higher, 650 feet a little later.
We got to, the Forest Service kept airplane around the mountain 24 hours a day for 6 months or more. And so the opportunity to go on that airplane and fly for 3 hours around and watching the volcano and looking at things was available for us. I used to go out at 3 o'clock in the morning, get on the airplane, view the volcano in the darkness, and so you could see the glowing lava from the vent. You could also see all the burning trees that were blown down. The trees actually, I mean, a lot of the forest caught on fire from the blast and the hot rock. And this stuff was burned all year until the snow, and then the next spring, when the snow melted, some of the big logs were still on fire. And started seeing a couple of those places around the mountain in this next spring in '81.
Up in the head, that would be the north end of the west arm of Spirit Lake. Spirit Lake's kind of like this two-fingered lake. The head of that is called Bear Cove. Up in there, there's a chunk of the debris avalanche, a landslide I was calling it. That was pretty amazing because for it to get there, what it meant is the landslide came down off the volcano, across the plain, went right through where Truman's Lodge was, into the lake. They must have ridden the floor of the lake bottom all the way and come up on the other side. And there it was, a big deposit of it up on that upper end of the lake. These huge hummocks of, dacite and basalt and stuff that come off the top of Mount St. Helens. This crazy hummocky pattern that we had begun to recognize as somehow indigenous to that particular slide. But I just remember being so impressed by it. Behind some of the hummocks, that is on the side away from the lake, there were gigantic log jams. They're still there probably, but they were clearly water laid. There were rocks in them, huge things, almost as high as the hummock. And they were on the north side of the hummocks. That's a record of that water having been thrown up there and rushing back at this huge flood into the lake again and making these gigantic log jams on the back sides or on the sides of these hummocks, a side away from the lake.
By late 1980, the focus shifted to the slow extrusion of lava within the crater. Multiple small eruptions and dome-building events continued to shape the mountain, and U.S. Geological Survey scientists worked to determine whether another larger-scale eruption was imminent.
The first time the helicopter turns its engines off, and it wasn't quiet in the crater. The crater was full of noise. I mean, rocks crashing, and you could hear, continuously rocks falling down the crater walls and crashing, and there were hissing noises of fumaroles around the sides of the dome that we'd never heard them before, because the helicopter was always blanking out this sound. And so it was a kind of a realization that there was something else happening in the crater that we hadn't experienced yet.
We've noticed that there were cracks developing on the crater floor that radiated out from the dome, more or less like spokes radiating out from the hub of a bicycle wheel. We didn't know if that cracking represented cooling of the hot crater fill that had been in place on May 18th, or if it represented swelling and extension of the crater floor. So we decided to start monitoring those cracks just to see what we could learn about them, and we brought out pieces of rebar a foot or two long and drove them into the ground and got out our trusty tape measure and simply tape measured the distance between these rebars. What we found is that leading up to the explosion and dome growth in late October, the cracks we were measuring were opening. And they seemed to be opening at an ever-increasing rate leading up to the last period of measurement before the dome growth. So that was kind of interesting, but just one of a kind. After the dome had been enlarged in October and things had quieted down, we went back in there again, found some of our old stations and put in new crack measurement stations and measured them through November. And through December, the cracks were widening again and at an ever-increasing rate, which led up to the dome growth at the end of December. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to recognize that there were two periods that looked pretty much the same, so maybe this is predictive. So in January, we started doing the same thing. We also started climbing on the dome at about that same time, but we were continuing our measurements of the cracks, and the openings started to accelerate again. And so at some evening meeting we had over at the Forest Service building, I told Don Peterson, who was the scientist in charge here then, Don, I think that we're going to have another period of dome growth within X days from now, based on the cracks. And he was intrigued, and we decided not to say anything publicly because we only had these two examples to go on. Lo and behold, we saw the same pattern before the next growth, which I think was late January or early February. So the next time around, leading up to the late March event, we again saw this pattern of increasing rate of opening. So we then started going public. Started making predictions with a time window within which we thought the eruption would occur on the basis of the rate of opening. And it worked, and we all felt very, very good about that. A very simple, obviously simple technique, basic, just making a measurement with a tape measure. But this worked remarkably well and was very useful to us and to the Forest Service in anticipating when the next period of crisis would be.
Ultimately, the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens was a landmark event for scientists and provided invaluable insights into volcanic processes, hazard prediction, and ecosystem recovery. Mount St. Helens remains an active volcano, with periodic eruptions and dome-building events recorded in the years following the 1980 eruption.
It was truly only the beginning of an eruptive episode that lasted for a little over 6 years. So the first explosion occurred on May 18, and then there were several sizable explosions in the summer of 1980, and they sort of trailed off until October of 1980. And then for the next 5 years, or 5.5 years, there were a series of dome-building eruptions. in which molten material came out, very viscous, pasty lava came out on the floor of the crater and piled up to form a dome or a mound in the middle of the crater floor, about 900 feet high, sitting on the floor of the crater. So this episode at Mount St. Helens, which began on May 18, actually culminated in October of 1986, when the last magma came out of the ground. Obviously, for volcanologists in the United States, the Mount St. Helens eruption was a spectacular learning opportunity.
It led to the establishment of improved volcanic monitoring systems, including seismic networks, GPS, and gas emission measurements.
We learned a lot about how you interact with civil defense, with the public, with the press, and that was transferred by the press to the world. And as a result, I think volcanology took a multi-giga quantum leap in science as well as applicability to society's needs. And I think it was probably the most important eruption in the history of volcanology.
The eruption heightened public understanding of volcanic hazards. Emergency response strategies were reevaluated and improved for future eruptions worldwide.
I think all of us were a little numbed by having lost Dave Johnston, and I knew two other people who were killed in the eruption as well. And so we were both more wary of the crater than we might otherwise have been, because that was the source of the problem. And also, speaking for myself, I was also motivated by those deaths to try to do better than I was doing before, to down the road try to save lives that kind of make up for the loss of our colleagues. So I think we were both cautious and moved to do better as a result of what had happened on May 18th.
The subsequent eruptions were actually, most of them were forecast fairly accurately by the USGS team of scientists. So when it looked like another explosion was about to take place, our helicopter crews would pick us up and we'd move out to the outskirts of the blast zone. We'd watch and photograph the next eruption. As soon as the eruption stopped, we'd race out there and study the deposits while they were still hot, while they were just after they'd settled onto the ground. So it turned out that the 8 years that Mount St. Helens was erupting in the early 1980s was an opportunity, an unprecedented opportunity for USGS scientists to study hot, fresh, young, and exciting deposits from explosive volcanism. And we learned incredibly new and important bits of information about how volcanoes like Mount St. Helens work, what kinds of deposits are produced during these explosive eruptions, and how to anticipate and mitigate the consequences of explosions.
The eruption of Mount St. Helens on May 18, 1980, stands as a defining moment in volcanic history, altering our understanding of these powerful natural forces. For the families who lost loved ones, homes, and entire communities, it was a profound tragedy, etched in memory. For scientists, however, the disaster became a catalyst for innovation, pushing the boundaries of monitoring technology and deepening knowledge about volcanology as a whole. Through devastation came discovery, and in the decades since, life has returned to the blast zone, thriving in the shadow of the mountain. Mount St. Helens reminds us of the delicate balance we share with the forces of nature and the resilience of life in the face of adversity.